what I also found about Ubuntu that is particularly interesting and that changes everything for us, I think, when we think about more Western philosophy, is this idea of power. So in Western philosophy, we focus very much on power as material resources, be it arms, money, whoever is stronger physically, basically, has the power and tries to dominate. This is our understanding of power. At best, we have some kind of balance or a stalemate or some kind of leverage and coalition. But my understanding of Ubuntu is that power is seen as mutual empowerment. It's force-based. It's something that is much more intangible and that brings people together. So we have more of it the more we include other people. And that makes a big difference in how we approach problems and try and govern ourselves.
Okay, welcome to Podcastocracy, Worldwide Deliberation, where we explore ideas shaping our societies and governance. My name is Bartłomiej Małczyński, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Leyla Tavernaro-Haidarian. She's an international course manager, academic expert, and lecturer, as well as the strategic internalization lead in the Department of Communication at the Vienna University of Applied Sciences for Management and Communication. Dr. Tavernaro-Haidarian, thank you for joining us today.
It is such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Let's start with a fundamental question. What is deliberative democracy to you? How would you define it both theoretically and in practice?
Mm-hmm. Well, deliberative democracy is an approach to governance or to democracy and to democratic living where decision-making is based on a process of what most people would say is discussion and debate, fair discussion and debate. I would say deliberation and consultation. So slightly less confrontational and more mutualistic. I believe that citizens can engage in thoughtful and reasoned conversations about political issues, social issues, with the aim of reaching a collective decision that reflects the common good and not just the interests of specific parties or factions. So the key idea to me is that individuals can participate in open, inclusive dialogue, considering various perspectives, listening to one another, and really deliberating on the merits of various different viewpoints and perspectives. So it's important, I think, that it's not just about what the majority wants, it's about the involvement of citizens. And in practice, I think that it's still something that we're learning about in various pockets of society. We don't have, I don't believe, any society that is practicing truly deliberative democracy, but I think that we have experiences in various different communities, organizations, and I think it involves moving away from polarizing debates to inclusive conversations.
Thank you for this introduction. And moving from the theory to practice, what would you say are some practical experience with governance and communication approaches that promote understanding and move beyond the partisanship?
Mm-hmm. Well, to various degrees, I've seen specific companies and experienced especially CSR projects, corporate social responsibility projects in companies. I've also seen communities, particularly in South Africa, engage in some genuinely mutualistic approaches to governance. Perhaps the most memorable insights I gained was from the space of media and mediated discourse in South Africa from watching television. When I lived there, I had the experience that I would watch talk shows and reality shows that were very different from what I was used to in Europe and in the United States. So coming from Europe and the United States, I was used to very sensationalist talk shows and reality television where there was a framing, there was a specific setup that was quite confrontational. People were set up to argue, to fight, and this is what made good television. However, in South Africa, I would see those same formats, topics, discussions in a very different way. People would sit together, perhaps even in a circle, exploring a topic, asking each other questions, sharing, and really supporting each other, even when their viewpoints were different. So it sort of transcended this partisan approach. And I thought that was very interesting and valuable. And I think we can develop a taste that is a taste for media that is also mutualistic. So that was one of the most memorable experiences I had.
So you've worked closely with various communities and institutions, particularly in South Africa, but also beyond Africa. Could you share some of your experience in those contexts?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I think that perhaps whether it was a community project where we were working with a local school, for example, in South Africa, where we were learning how to make the school more effective because that school had so many problems. It was underfunded and students were not completing their work. They were not finishing high school. Teachers were exhausted. Whether it was this setting or that corporate setting I told you about, there are certain things that I noticed that make for good communication and that help this process of deliberation. One was the fact that almost always it was very helpful to have a spatial arrangement, circular seating that allowed people to face each other equally, to have small groups that talk to each other, that are intimate, where perhaps people who don't feel as comfortable raising their hand can voice their opinion. People with gentler voices can raise their opinion. Also, I noticed that another characteristic of mutualistic and deliberative communication is when people try not to persuade each other of what is right and wrong, but rather practice listening and exploring. Aristotle, of course, a wonderful, very important father of philosophy, spoke a lot about that persuasive aspect of rhetoric. But there's other ways to do it as well. When you look at South African philosophy, feminist philosophy, there's a lot of emphasis on inviting people to participate, to listen, and explore rather than persuade. And I think the third thing I noticed in all of these settings that was practical is that wherever people wanted to make decisions in a governance setting, it was helpful to have a rhythm of planning, action, and reflection. So people would come together, plan, speak, share, then they would take collective action together, and then they would come back and reflect. So it became a process rather than one project that either fails or succeeds. So these are some elements I think that I've witnessed or experienced practically in various different settings.
You mentioned a lot of philosophical approaches, and that leads me to the philosophical questions. Could you elaborate on how your experience relates to deliberative theory and African philosophy, particularly Ubuntu?
Mm-hmm. So Ubuntu is perhaps one of the philosophies that I had a closer look at, and there are many people who know more about Ubuntu than me, but I was particularly touched by Ubuntu. And there are other philosophies in sub-Saharan Africa and all over the world, but I had the privilege of being there that are very interesting and that can inform our idea of deliberative democracy. Ubuntu can be described as a sense of unity and diversity. I am because we are. So there's a sense of collectivism, but the individual is still important. So it's not as though the individual is completely gone. He or she is still very important, but so is unity. What I also found about Ubuntu that is particularly interesting and that changes everything for us, I think, when we think about more Western philosophy, is this idea of power. So in Western philosophy, we focus very much on power as material resources, be it arms, money, whoever is stronger physically, basically, has the power and tries to dominate. This is our understanding of power. At best, we have some kind of balance or a stalemate or some kind of leverage and coalition. But my understanding of Ubuntu is that power is seen as mutual empowerment. It's force-based. It's something that is much more intangible and that brings people together. So we have more of it the more we include other people. And that makes a big difference in how we approach problems and try and govern ourselves. But even in Western philosophy, we find some of these things. I came across a scholar named Michael Carlberg who talks about Western liberal democracy and how it can evolve. And he has some very amazing ideas that go in that direction as well, that are very inspiring.
Now let's talk about the future trends. Because looking to the future, how might transitional societies and the others benefit from viewing decolonization as a process of construction and integration rather than resistance and confrontation? What could this mean for journalism, media, education, and other aspects of life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so decolonization is a big word that we hear in many settings. Everybody talks about it. I personally think that it's important not to glorify the past too much and imagine that there is some pure state that we can go back to, because even pre-colonial history has been fraught with contention and violence. If we look just in the Southern African region, the Zulu people, for example, they had many wars and conquered many other tribes to become who they were. So this process is not something that came with Western colonialism. It's always been part of our history. But we can learn from what was good and carry that forward, bring that forward. And I think that one of the good things we see in, for example, some of the African communities pre-colonialism is that they had non-partisan politics. They would get together, deliberate, sit under a tree, have communal decision-making, and actually speak to each other until they reached a common vision that was good for the whole community. Was it perfect? No, because it excluded many people. It excluded women, for example, right? So we have room to improve this. And so I think from our perspective today, we can think of decolonization as transcending colonization, as taking what's good and integrating what has been lost and valuable and merging the two and moving forward. And I think what this can mean for transitional societies and for others, it can mean that we build on our strengths, that we are constructive rather than destructive. And it can mean so many things. It can mean journalism and media don't have to only focus on their role as watchdogs of power, but also be supporters of fledgling democracies, supporters and fora for true public deliberation, to bring people together, not to polarize. And right now, the media especially are polarizing, especially social media. So we need to rethink this. How do we bring people together? So that's just one example, I think, of what can happen when we think of decolonization as integration.
And what you are saying, it reminds me the Michael Rothberg's theory of multi-directional memory. And I must ask in this very specific context about your perspective of the power relations What do you think about the restorative or transitional form of justice? Like, for instance, Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa or in Canada. On the vertical level, let's call it like the deliberation for reconciliation, yes? And do you believe that is the proper instrument to discuss and solving the issues related to colonization, racism, genocides, and other forms of violence?
I think it has an important role to play, and it's definitely taken South Africa forward, because I have the example of South Africa where I saw the effects of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It has its time and its place. I think justice is such a big term, but when there is a history of pain, and pain has been inflicted in many different ways, it can be extremely powerful and helpful for people to move on. And I think it prevented a lot of violence, potential violence, when that transition happened into democracy. But we're not perfect societies. We're learning, we're moving. And when you look at obviously society, even in South Africa today, we still have so many problems, and we still have violence and people not forgiving each other and having those dialogues. So you see both things happening at the same time. But I think there's a time and a place for both the more punitive justice and the more reconciliatory justice.
Are there real-life cases where oppressed groups resisted persecution through unification rather than the conflict?
Yeah. So this is very close to my heart, because I've been observing the Baha'i community in Iran that has been persecuted for, well, since the beginning of the faith, but particularly in the last 45 years, since the beginning of the Islamic Revolution, we've seen heightened persecutions where Baha'i children cannot go to school, they cannot go to university, they are not allowed to work in public offices, their civil rights are severely limited. And some forms of persecution are much more violent. Their graves are desecrated, their land is taken, they bulldoze their homes, they confiscate their things, they randomly arrest them. And yet, this community, instead of taking a strategy of resistance and fighting back, they haven't protested, they haven't exhibited violence. They have exhibited what some scholars refer to as constructive resilience or constructive action. So it's this idea of meeting oppression with creativity and service and continued effort to contribute to society. And I'll give you two examples. Because they are banned from participating in going to university and having tertiary education, they have really banded together to start their own university in their homes, in their offices, and they collaborate with people from abroad to do online classes with other institutions around the world, and they help educate themselves and help empower themselves in that way, and they are not breaking any formal laws while doing that. They get rated for doing that, but they have not, broken any formal laws. And also, they have a record of really participating in a lot of community activities, particularly educational activities for children, all kinds of children, Muslim children, Druze children, and providing them with help for school, math, geography, and also talking to them about certain things, values, principles, such as justice. What does that mean to you? Unity, so that you're building a culture where you are able to talk about the things that might lead to justice one day, right? Because what we've seen, these temporary things, this resistance, this fighting, this violence, doesn't create lasting change often. or if it does create change, it creates new problems that societies then deal with for decades. So that's a very good example to keep a close eye on, in my opinion.
Now let's discuss sustainability. Can you elaborate on the intersection of sustainability, communication, and ethics?
Yes. So sustainability has become a big topic in my life since moving back from South Africa to Europe. Sustainability, communication, ethics, all of these things have really become a center of my academic life and my professional life. At first, I found myself working with the United Nations on sustainable development goals. And now at this university in Vienna that places a huge emphasis on sustainability. And I'm learning that these three concepts are very intertwined, and I'm learning about how individuals, companies, institutions can really collaborate and communicate to bring together various stakeholders and achieve sustainability goals. What I've found out is it's not a quick fix, it's a process. And the more people participate, the more lasting and strong the effects are. And so I've also discovered a very exciting concept called the inner development goals. I don't know if you've heard about these. It was founded by an NGO in Stockholm in 2020, I believe. But it's an interesting framework that talks about inner things, such as collaboration, communication, empathy, all of these inner values that we have to cultivate in order to achieve the sustainable development goals. And many companies now, even big companies like IKEA, are looking at training their employees in those inner development goals in order to achieve sustainability goals that they have, for example, as companies. And I find that quite exciting to learn from and observe and participate in.
I've got one more question to wrap up. How can individuals, communities, and institutions communicate and organize effectively to promote stakeholders integration and achieve sustainability goals, particularly in the CSR context? If you could you elaborate?
Yeah, so what I'm learning currently is that sustainable development really needs to be thought more of in terms of human capacity, human-centered capacity. And we need to move away from those industrial era markers such as GDP and how technologically advanced we are as societies, but really look towards these inner qualities that we need to cultivate in human beings in order to achieve sustainability goals. I always bring this example to my students. I say, you know, if we try to tackle these challenges only with more science, but not with values, we create more problems. And it's that example of the straws, the plastic straws that were creating so many problems in the ocean. They replaced those with paper straws. And now we have more new environmental problems with the paper straws. So it's not just about replacing one thing with the other, reducing emissions. It's also about how we live, what we value. Are we practicing moderation? Are we speaking to each other? So many companies embark on sustainability journeys with a great idea and intention, but then along the way, they are causing problems that they didn't intend. So we need to bring together stakeholders. We need to bring together people, communities that are being affected by companies, and include them in these CSR activities and our sustainability activities. And deliberation, an attitude of learning, this idea of planning, action, and reflection, these are the things that can help us do that. And I read a very exciting Harvard Business Review article that talks about how CSR is moving into that direction, where it's really about this humble posture of learning, about being authentic and transparent, inviting people, reflecting, and constantly refining your plan, because your first plan is going to be flawed, and we have to work on making it better and better. Personally, last thing I will say is, even in my personal life, I have the privilege of having a wonderful group of friends. And this wonderful friend of mine, who is a dear Polish friend of mine, and myself, we started this evening where we invite our friends. We call it the Open Minds Club. And we have dinner and we speak about political, social, spiritual issues that might be a little bit difficult, where we might have different opinions, but we've created a safe space where everyone can voice their opinion, be heard, and where conversation is respectful. And I think it's important to cultivate that on individual, community, and organizational level.
And the last question, I would like to ask you about the book recommendations.
Beyond a Culture of Contest is my favorite book right now by Michael Carlberg. And it has some insightful reflections on our democratic systems and how we can move towards more deliberative democracies. And it has some great examples and inspiration.
Dr. Tavernaro-Haidarian, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. It's been an enlightening conversation. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.